Welcome to Mildly Interesting and Sleepy, a little corner of the night for stories that are not urgent, not loud, and not trying to win an argument with your nervous system. Tonight, we are going to wander through the entire history of Rome as though it were a long road of stone lit by moonlight. This is not a school exam. There will be no quiz at the end. You do not need to remember every emperor, every reform, or every battle. If details drift by like clouds, that is perfectly fine. What I want to do tonight is give you a feeling. The feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous and old, looking back across more than 1,000 years of one civilization's heartbeat. Rome was not a single thing. It was a city, then an empire, then an idea, then a memory that refused to go away. It shaped languages you speak, laws courts use, the very alphabet your eyes are reading right now. And yet it started, as so many things do, with a small group of people on a hill, looking out over a river, deciding this was a good place to stay. So make yourself comfortable, let the lights be low, and let us begin at the very beginning in the hills of central Italy, before Rome was even a word. The land before Rome. Long before anyone called it Rome, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of peoples living lives that were mostly quiet, mostly local, mostly organized around rivers and seasons, and the particular character of whatever land they happened to occupy. The peninsula itself is shaped something like a boot, stretching south from the Alps into the Mediterranean Sea. It is a land of hills and valleys, of volcanic soil that grows food generously, of rivers that flood in winter and shrink to muddy threads in summer. The western coast of central Italy, the region we now call Latium, was home to a collection of small Latin-speaking communities. These were farming villages mostly, people who kept cattle and grew grain and made offerings to gods of hearth and storm and harvest. They were not wealthy by the standards of the wider Mediterranean world. The great civilizations of Greece and Phoenicia and Egypt would have found them unremarkable. And yet, in the gentle hills along a bend in the Tiber River, something was quietly beginning. To the north of the Latin villages lay the Etruscans, a people who have fascinated historians and archaeologists for centuries because so much about them remains mysterious. They were sophisticated, artistic, and urban in ways the Latin villages were not yet. They built cities with grid-planned streets, painted their tombs with scenes of banqueting and music, and developed a form of writing the Romans would eventually borrow and transform into the Latin alphabet. For a long time, the Etruscans were the dominant force in central Italy, and their influence on early Rome was deep and lasting. To the south were Greek colonies, planted along the coastline of what the Greeks called Magna Graecia, or Great Greece. These were proper cities, with temples and theatres and markets and philosophers. The Greeks brought their art and their gods and their way of thinking about civic life, and all of it filtered northward into the rough countryside where Rome was slowly taking shape. And so the world into which Rome was born was not empty or simple. It was a world already dense with culture and conflict, with trade and rivalry, with the slow geological pressure of peoples pressing against one another. Rome would learn from all of them, borrow from all of them, and eventually, in its peculiar way, absorb all of them. The myth and the founding. Every civilization needs a creation story, and Rome had several. The most famous, the one that schoolchildren would eventually recite for 1,000 years, is the story of Romulus and Remus. According to the legend, these twin boys were born to a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia and the god Mars. Their great uncle, a man named Amulius who had seized the throne of Alba Longa from his brother, ordered them thrown into the Tiber River to drown. But the river carried them to shore rather than to death. A she-wolf found the infants on the bank and nursed them. A shepherd named Faustulus eventually discovered them and raised them as his own. The twins grew up, overthrew Amulius, restored their grandfather to the throne, and then went off to found a city of their own. They chose the hills along the Tiber, but they could not agree on which hill should be the site, and this disagreement, as disagreements between brothers sometimes do, turned violent. Romulus killed Remus, marked out the boundary of his new city, and became its first king. This was, according to Roman tradition, in the year 753 before the Common Era. The Romans were not naive people. They knew their founding stories were myths, but myths serve a function that history sometimes cannot, because they carry meaning more than they carry facts. The story of Romulus and Remus told Romans something about themselves, that they were descended from a god, that they were nurtured by the wild, that their founding was marked by conflict and will and the sometimes brutal demands of ambition. There is something almost brutally honest about a people whose founding story begins with a brother killing a brother. The other great Roman founding myth is older and ties Rome to the wider Mediterranean world. This is the story of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who fled the destruction of Troy and sailed westward, eventually landing in Italy. His descendants, the legend goes, founded Alba Longa, and from Alba Longa came Romulus and Remus. This myth was later elaborated into one of the greatest poems of the ancient world, Virgil's Aeneid, which gave Rome a connection to the heroic age of Greece and a sense of divine destiny that would prove politically very useful to a certain Julio-Claudian family some centuries later. The Romans also, somewhat more practically, told a story about themselves as a people who welcomed outsiders. In the early days, Romulus needed citizens. He reportedly offered asylum to anyone who came, regardless of origin: runaway slaves, exiles, fugitives, the desperate, and the ambitious. Rome was, from its very beginning in the mythological telling, a city that absorbed whoever arrived. This self-image of absorption and inclusion was not always matched by historical reality, but it was a genuine part of how Romans understood their own identity. They were a people made of many peoples. The Seven Kings. The Romans believed that after Romulus, Rome was ruled by 6 more kings, for a total of 7. Modern historians treat this royal period with considerable skepticism. The names and reigns have the quality of myth more than record, and the dates are impossibly tidy. But archaeology does confirm that in the late 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the site of Rome was developing from scattered villages into something that looked more like a unified settlement. There were kings, or something like kings. There was a growing community on and around the Palatine and Capitoline hills. Something was happening. Tradition names Romulus first, a figure so divine in memory that he was eventually said to have been taken up into the sky and became a god himself. Then came Numa Pompilius, remembered as the great religious organizer of Rome, the man who established the priestly colleges and the calendar and the temples. Where Romulus was the warrior founder, Numa was the priest lawgiver, and together they represented the 2 pillars Rome always tried to keep in balance: military strength and religious order. After Numa came Tullus Hostilius, who warred against Alba Longa and destroyed it, absorbing its people into Rome. Then Ancus Marcius, who extended Roman territory to the sea and founded the port of Ostia. Then 2 kings with Etruscan names, Tarquinius Priscus and Servius Tullius, whose very names suggest the deep Etruscan influence on early Rome. Under these kings, Roman tradition said, the city was truly built. The great drain called the Cloaca Maxima that cleared the marshy Forum Valley, the Circus Maximus for games and races, the first stone wall around the hills. And then the last king, Tarquinius Superbus. Superbus means arrogant, which is the kindest translation. Tarquin the Proud, as he is sometimes called, was remembered as a tyrant. His son committed a terrible crime against a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia, who killed herself after. Her father and husband and their allies, led by a man named Lucius Junius Brutus, led a revolt. In 509 BCE, the Romans expelled their king and swore they would never again be ruled by one man with that title. Whether this story is precisely true in its details hardly matters. What matters is that Rome in the late 6th century made a decisive turn away from monarchy. The city that had been evolving under kings now reinvented itself as something new, something that had no exact parallel in the ancient world. It became a republic. The republic takes shape. The Roman Republic is one of history's great experiments in self-governance, imperfect and often brutal, but genuinely innovative in ways that ripple forward to the present day. Where kings had held power personally and permanently, the Republic distributed power through institutions and limited it in time. No one person would rule forever. Power would be shared, checked, and renewed. At the heart of the Republic were two consuls, elected each year, who shared the highest executive authority. The one-year limit was crucial. A man could be consul again later, but not year after year without interruption. And two consuls meant that each could veto the other, that no single voice had final say. This was a deliberate architecture of mutual restraint. Below the consuls, a growing list of other magistracies developed over time. Praetors who administered justice, censors who counted citizens and watched over public morals, quaestors who managed finances, aediles who oversaw public buildings and games. All of these positions were elected, all were annual, all were unpaid. Roman public service was supposed to be just that, service, not profit. Men competed for these offices not for salary, but for honor and influence. Above all of this sat the Senate, an assembly of former magistrates, a body of experienced elder statesmen who in practice held enormous power, even though they technically only advised the magistrates rather than commanding them. The Senate controlled finance, foreign policy, the allocation of armies and provinces. When the Senate spoke with one voice, Rome generally moved in that direction. The Senate was aristocratic, conservative, and deeply committed to its own authority. And then there were the assemblies, where Roman male citizens voted on laws and elections. These too were complicated and layered, organized in ways that gave more weight to wealthier citizens, and in practice often confirmed what the magistrates and Senate had already arranged. Roman democracy was real but limited. Into this system was also built a release valve, the dictatorship. In moments of extreme crisis, the Senate could appoint a dictator with absolute power for a maximum of 6 months. The dictatorship was supposed to be temporary, and for centuries it was. Men appointed dictator handled the emergency and then gave the power back. This restraint was so admired that when later men held similar power and refused to relinquish it, the Romans had no word for what they had become, because the old word for it had been contaminated by association with Etruscan tyranny. The word king had become, essentially, a curse. Running alongside all of this was the great social tension that would define much of Republican history, the conflict between patricians and plebeians. The patricians were the old aristocratic families who had controlled Roman government since the beginning. The plebeians were everyone else, which meant most people, including wealthy merchants and smallholders and the urban poor. For the first century and a half of the Republic, plebeians were excluded from most major offices and from the Senate. They fought for inclusion through a slow, grinding process of strikes and legal challenges, and eventually political victories that scholars call the struggle of the orders. Over time, plebeians won the right to their own representative officials, the tribunes, who had the power to veto any action of any magistrate, and whose persons were declared sacred and untouchable. Eventually, plebeians could hold consulships, could enter the Senate, could reach the highest dignities of the state. The conflict was never fully resolved, and its echoes would rumble through Roman history in new forms. But by the 3rd century BCE, the formal legal barrier between patrician and plebeian had largely dissolved. What emerged was not exactly equality. Rome was never a country of equals, but it was a society with mechanisms for managing its internal tensions, for absorbing ambitious men from outside the old elite into the system, for making those who threatened disruption into stakeholders instead. This capacity for co-optation was one of Rome's greatest political gifts. The Italian Wars and the making of a Mediterranean power. The early republic spent much of its energy on survival and expansion, which in the world of ancient Italy were not entirely different things. The Latin communities around Rome were sometimes allies, sometimes rivals. The hill peoples of central Italy, the Samnites and Sabines and Volscians, pressed in from the mountains. The Etruscans remained a power to the north. And in 390 BCE, an event happened that Romans never forgot. The Gauls came. A tribe of Celtic peoples from the north swept down through Etruria and defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia. They then sacked Rome itself. The city was looted and burned. The Romans retreated to the Capitoline Hill and held out while the Gauls occupied everything below. Eventually, the invaders were bought off or repulsed. The exact circumstances vary by source, and they withdrew northward. But the trauma was lasting. Romans rebuilt their city with new walls, rededicated themselves to military discipline, and carried a deep anxiety about the northern barbarians for generations. After the Gallic crisis, Rome slowly and methodically consolidated its hold on Italy. This was not a single campaign, but a series of wars over more than a century. The Latin Wars, the Samnite Wars, the wars against the Greek cities of the south. Each conflict ended with defeated peoples being incorporated into a Roman system that was, by ancient standards, quite generous. Defeated Italians were not enslaved wholesale or simply destroyed. Instead, they were given different grades of relationship with Rome. Some became full citizens, some became allies with their own internal autonomy. All were required to provide soldiers for Roman armies. Rome was building something that was less an empire in the old sense and more a confederation, with Rome at the center extracting military manpower in exchange for protection and a kind of shared prestige. The soldiers this system produced were formidable. The Roman legion was not a new invention in these years, but it was refined and sharpened through constant use. Roman infantry fought in a particular way, in tight formations that combined the throwing of weighted javelins with close-quarters swordwork, and this combination proved devastatingly effective against most opponents they encountered. Roman armies also had a discipline and an engineering capability that set them apart. They built fortified camps at every night's march, constructed siege works with professional efficiency, and maintained supply lines that allowed them to operate far from home for extended periods. By around 270 BCE, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. The Greek cities of the south were the last to submit, having called in a Greek king named Pyrrhus of Epirus to help them resist. Pyrrhus was one of the finest generals of the age, and he defeated the Romans in battle twice. But his victories cost him so heavily in men that they gave rise to the expression Pyrrhic victory, a win that destroys you. Pyrrhus eventually gave up and sailed home, and Rome absorbed the south. Standing on the southern tip of Italy, looking across a narrow stretch of water to Sicily, Roman eyes were drawn to what lay beyond. Carthage and the Punic Wars. Carthage was Rome's great rival, perhaps the only power in the Western Mediterranean that could match Rome in ambition, wealth, and military capability. Founded by Phoenician colonists from the Eastern Mediterranean, Carthage had grown into a commercial empire centered in what is now Tunisia. It controlled much of North Africa, large parts of Spain, and exercised influence over Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. It was rich beyond Roman imagining, sustained by trade rather than agriculture, with a navy that dominated the Western Sea. The first war between Rome and Carthage, which we call the First Punic War, began in 264 BCE over Sicily and lasted for 23 years. It was the longest continuous war Rome had yet fought, and it revealed something important about the Roman character, a capacity for absorbing catastrophic losses and continuing anyway. Rome built its first major fleet to fight Carthage at sea, which required creating an entire naval tradition essentially from nothing. Roman ships were lost by the hundreds in storms and battles. Roman armies suffered terrible defeats, and yet Rome kept sending more ships, more men, more resources. Eventually, Carthage agreed to peace, surrendering Sicily and paying a large indemnity. Rome had its first province outside Italy. The peace lasted 20 years. Then Carthage's greatest general, Hamilcar Barca, began expanding Carthaginian power in Spain, and when his son Hannibal inherited command, the stage was set for the most dangerous war Rome ever fought. Hannibal Barca is one of the most celebrated military commanders in history, and for good reason. In 218 BCE, he marched his army from Spain, crossed the Pyrenees, traversed the Alps with elephants, descended into northern Italy, and proceeded to destroy Roman army after Roman army in battles of stunning tactical genius. At Trebia in 218, at Lake Trasimene in 217, and most devastatingly at Cannae in 216, Hannibal encircled and annihilated Roman forces. At Cannae alone, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. It was a catastrophe of proportions that are almost incomprehensible. And yet Rome did not surrender. The Senate refused to negotiate with Hannibal. Dictator Fabius Maximus adopted a strategy of harassment and avoidance, earning the nickname Cunctator, the Delayer, and later, when the strategy proved correct, the Preserver. Roman allies in Italy mostly held firm, not joining Hannibal as he had hoped they would. Hannibal was brilliant in the field, but had no siege train capable of taking fortified cities, and Rome itself remained beyond his reach. He wandered Italy for 15 years, winning battles and achieving nothing. Meanwhile, Rome struck elsewhere. Scipio Africanus, the general who would eventually win the war, took the fight to Spain, then to Africa itself. Carthage recalled Hannibal to defend the homeland. At Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal in a pitched battle, the first time Hannibal had lost a major engagement. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were brutal: all territory outside Africa, the entire war fleet, an enormous indemnity paid over 50 years, and a prohibition against making war without Roman permission. Carthage was no longer an independent power in any meaningful sense. But Rome was not done with Carthage. The old Senator Cato ended every speech, whatever the topic, with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, a pretext was found. War was declared on technical grounds that were barely distinguishable from assassination. And in 146 BCE, after a 3-year siege, Carthage was taken. The city was burned. Its population was sold into slavery. The land was made a Roman province. The story that the Romans salted the earth to prevent anything from growing there is almost certainly not true, but it captures the spirit of the destruction perfectly. The same year, 146 BCE, a Roman army destroyed Corinth in Greece, which had been asserting itself troublesomely. Both great rival civilizations of the Western and Eastern Mediterranean on the same year ceased to exist as independent entities. Rome was now, indisputably, the master of the known world. The Republic in crisis. Victory on such an enormous scale has consequences. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome was rich and powerful and deeply troubled. The wars had done something to Roman society that the Senate had not anticipated and could not easily undo. The small farmers of Italy who had formed the backbone of the Roman army were disappearing. Decades of military service had taken men away from their land. In their absence, wealthy landowners had bought up or seized their farms, replacing free peasant labor with slaves captured in the wars. These great estates, called latifundia, were worked by chains of enslaved people and were extremely profitable, but produced a social catastrophe. A growing population of landless Romans crowding into cities, economically marginal, politically volatile. At the same time, the Roman aristocracy was becoming self-satisfied and defensive. The Senate closed ranks around its privileges. The system that had been so good at absorbing ambitious men was beginning to calcify, and brilliant men with legitimate grievances and large followings had nowhere to go within the existing system. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried to address the land problem through legal reform. Tiberius was elected tribune in 133 BCE and proposed redistributing public land that wealthy Romans had illegally occupied. It was not a radical proposal by any modern standard, but it threatened established wealth. And when Tiberius tried to get re-elected to continue his work, a mob of senators and their clients beat him to death. It was the first political murder in Rome in centuries, and it opened a door that could never be closed. 12 years later, his brother Gaius pursued a broader reform program and went further, threatening the Senate's grip more directly. He too was killed, along with thousands of his supporters, in what was essentially a government-sanctioned massacre. The Senate had discovered that it could use violence to preserve itself, and having made that discovery, the violence would not stop. The generations that followed saw a parade of crises. Rome discovered it needed professional soldiers rather than citizen farmers when a general named Gaius Marius reformed the army in the late 2nd century, creating a volunteer force that served for years and looked to their general rather than to the state for reward. This was efficient militarily and catastrophic politically, because it meant that whoever commanded a loyal army had a different kind of power than the old magistrates had held. An army was not an abstraction. An army was armed men who would go where their general pointed them. Marius himself dominated Roman politics through a combination of military genius and popular appeal, holding the consulship an unprecedented 7 times. Then came Sulla, his rival, who in 88 BCE marched his army on Rome itself, the first time a Roman general had done such a thing, and took the city by force. He fought a civil war, won it, made himself dictator, and then did something extraordinary. He used his power to reform the constitution in favor of the Senate, and then resigned and went into retirement. He died of natural causes, but the lesson of what an army could do had been taught, and others would draw different conclusions from it than Sulla had intended. The late Republic was a century of extraordinary men in impossible situations, of brilliant minds trying to navigate a system that was breaking down. Pompey cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months when it had plagued Rome for decades. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, tried to match military glory and died at Carrhae in a disastrous campaign against the Parthians. Cicero, the great orator and philosopher, tried to hold the Republic together with words when swords were what the moment required. And then there was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar is one of the most written about human beings who ever lived, which makes it easy to forget how strange his story is when you come at it fresh. He was born in 100 BCE into an old patrician family of modest wealth and considerable ancestry. He was educated brilliantly, was personally brave to a degree that sometimes looked like recklessness, and had a political intelligence that combined genuine idealism with a thorough absence of illusion about human nature. He was also, by all accounts, charming in a way that made people feel seen and valued, which is always a dangerous quality in a politician. Caesar's rise was not smooth. He was captured by pirates as a young man, was ransacked for ransom, spent his captivity trading jokes with his captors while promising to return and crucify them, and then, once ransomed, did exactly that. He served as a military tribune, as quaestor, as aedile, where he put on games so spectacular they left the city speechless. He formed a political alliance with Pompey and Crassus, which historians call the First Triumvirate, though the Romans had no such term. He got himself appointed governor of the Gallic provinces. And then he conquered Gaul. Over roughly 8 years, from 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar extended Roman territory to the Rhine and the English Channel, subjugated hundreds of tribes, killed or enslaved vast numbers of people, and sent home enough wealth to fund his political ambitions many times over. His Gallic Wars, written up by Caesar himself in clear and elegant prose, is one of the few surviving accounts of a Roman campaign from the commander's own pen. It is also, of course, propaganda, but propaganda that shaped how later Romans and Europeans understood the conquest of France for 2,000 years. The wars were brutal. The siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, where Caesar simultaneously besieged a Gallic stronghold and defended against a massive relief force by building 2 concentric rings of fortification miles long, is one of the great feats of military engineering in history. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, who had unified much of Gaul against Rome in a final desperate resistance, surrendered after Alesia. Caesar kept him alive for years to walk in his triumph, then had him strangled in a Roman prison. By 49 BCE, Caesar was a military hero of the First Order, immensely wealthy and immensely threatening to the Senate, which tried to use the law to strip him of his command and force him to return to Rome as a private citizen vulnerable to prosecution. Caesar had a choice: submit or fight. On January 10th, 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary between the province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper, with his army. This was treason. It was also the beginning of the end of the Republic. Pompey, who had been his ally and was now his rival and the Senate's champion, fled Italy with the Senate when Caesar came south. Caesar pursued, defeated Pompey's forces in a campaign of remarkable speed across Spain, Greece, and Egypt. Pompey was murdered by agents of the Egyptian king before Caesar could reach him. Caesar spent time in Egypt, where he met and became involved with Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, and had a son with her, Caesarion. By 45 BCE, Caesar had won the civil wars. He held a succession of extravagant triumphs and then began to govern. He passed a series of genuinely useful reforms, extending citizenship, reorganizing local governments, reforming the calendar into something very close to what we still use today. The Julian calendar, introduced in 46 BCE, was the calendar of Europe until the Gregorian reform of the 16th century. But the fundamental question, what Caesar was, what he wanted to be, what Rome was becoming, remained unanswered. Caesar held the dictatorship perpetually, which the Romans had never done, and accumulated honors and titles that edged toward the divine. He did not call himself king, knowing that word would be fatal in Rome, but his power was effectively royal. A group of senators who valued the old republic, led by Cassius Longinus and Caesar's close friend Marcus Junius Brutus, decided that assassination was the only remedy. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times in the theater of Pompey by a group of senators with daggers hidden under their togas. He fell and died at the foot of a statue of Pompey. He was 55 years old. The assassins had killed a man. They had not restored a republic. The chaos that followed would be worse than anything that had come before. The death of the Republic. Caesar's assassination plunged Rome into another round of civil wars, more destructive and more total than anything the city had yet experienced. The conspirators had a plan to kill Caesar, but no plan for what came after, which is a common failing of those who believe that removing a person will remove the conditions that created that person. Caesar's right-hand man, Mark Antony, was left alive and very, very angry. Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son Octavian, a young man of 18 who had been studying in Greece when his great uncle was killed, came to Italy to claim his inheritance. The Senate tried to play Octavian and Antony off against each other. Neither man was inclined to be played. Cicero, whose speeches against Antony are among the most magnificent pieces of political invective in the Western tradition, died for it. He was proscribed, hunted down, and killed, his hands and head displayed in the forum. His tongue, which had spoken so many words, was reportedly stabbed repeatedly by Antony's wife Fulvia with a hairpin. History is sometimes very specific in its cruelties. Octavian, Antony, and a third man, Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate and divided the Roman world among them. They used proscription lists, lists of enemies to be killed and whose property would be seized, on a massive scale. Thousands died. The surviving Republican forces, commanded by Brutus and Cassius, were defeated at the twin battles of Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BCE. Brutus and Cassius killed themselves. Then the triumvirs turned on each other. Lepidus was gradually sidelined. Antony ruled the eastern provinces and allied himself with Cleopatra, whose resources he needed. Octavian, in Rome, built his popular support carefully and methodically, presenting himself as the defender of Italian values against Antony's eastern decadence. The propaganda was effective and not entirely false. Antony and Cleopatra were building something in Egypt that looked very much like a hereditary dynasty aimed at the eastern Mediterranean, and it did not fit comfortably within Roman ideas of how the world should be organized. War came in 31 BCE. At the naval battle of Actium, off the western coast of Greece, Octavian's Admiral Agrippa defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. The pair fled to Egypt. Antony, receiving false news that Cleopatra was dead, killed himself. Cleopatra, faced with the prospect of walking in Octavian's triumph as a captive, also killed herself. She was 39 years old, and with her the long line of the Ptolemies, the last of the great successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great, came to an end. Octavian stood alone. He was 32 years old and the most powerful man in the world. The question was what to do with that power without making the same mistake his adopted father had made. Augustus and the birth of empire. Octavian's answer was brilliant, patient, and deeply dishonest in the best possible way. He would not be a king. He would not be a dictator. He would restore the Republic, except that he would do all of this while retaining every lever of actual power. The Republic would be a performance, and a sincere one in some ways, because Romans genuinely loved the forms of it, and Octavian understood that what people love about tradition is very often its shape rather than its substance. In 27 BCE, Octavian staged a ceremony in which he handed back to the Senate his extraordinary powers. The Senate, in a move that had certainly been arranged in advance, gave most of them back and added something new, the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was not a political office. It was a religious honorific, and it changed everything because it elevated its holder above the merely human order of magistrates and consuls without requiring the forbidden title of king. Augustus, as Octavian was now known, held the office of consul for a while, then stepped back from that too. He held tribunician power permanently, which gave him the veto over any act of any official and the protection of sacrosanct status. He held proconsular authority over the provinces where the armies were stationed, which meant he commanded the legions. He had the title princeps, first citizen, which was just an honorific but became the name for what he was. From princeps comes our word prince, and from it, the academic term for the imperial system Augustus created, the Principate. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, trials were still held, laws were still passed. The machinery of the Republic turned and turned. It simply operated within the magnetic field of one man's will, and nothing that field did not approve would stand. And Augustus used his power, on the whole, carefully and well. He reorganized the provinces. He reformed the tax system. He created a professional standing army and a praetorian guard. He rebuilt Rome on an enormous scale, replacing old brick with marble, completing projects begun by Caesar and others, and commissioning new temples and public buildings. He is said to have remarked that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and the boast was not entirely empty. He also presided over what became one of the great literary flowerings in human history. The Augustan age produced Virgil, whose Aeneid gave Rome its great national epic, the poem that tied the city's destiny to divine providence and made Augustus's rule seem like the fulfillment of a plan that had begun with the fall of Troy. It produced Horace, whose odes are still read with pleasure 2,000 years later. It produced Ovid, whose Metamorphoses is one of the most endlessly generative collections of mythology ever written, and whose art of love got him exiled, because Augustus was deeply invested in a moral reform program that Ovid's cheerful cynicism directly undermined. It produced Livy, who wrote a history of Rome from its founding that shaped how Romans and then Europeans understood the Roman past for centuries. Augustus ruled for 41 years as emperor, a word derived from imperator, meaning commander, a title Roman generals had given themselves after victories since the early Republic, but which now became attached permanently to one man's position. He outlived most of his chosen successors, his nephew Marcellus, his son-in-law Agrippa, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius. He was forced in the end to settle on his stepson Tiberius, whom he did not much like, as the next ruler. He died in 14 CE in his 70s in the town of Nola in southern Italy. His last words were reported as either a reference to the performance of his life, asking if he had played his part well enough in the comedy, or a tender goodbye to his wife Livia. Both versions are probably true in spirit, if not in fact. He had been the most consequential individual in Roman history, perhaps in world history up to that point. What he built would last, in one form or another, for 5 centuries in the West and 15 in the East. The Julio-Claudian dynasty. The emperors who followed Augustus, the 4 men who inherited his position through his family, are among the most famous and most strange figures in Roman history. Their personalities, their ambitions, and their failures were recorded by historians, particularly Tacitus and Suetonius, with a vividness that has made them feel almost contemporary even across 2,000 years. Tiberius ruled from 14 to 37 CE. He was a capable general and a competent administrator who hated being emperor and was hated in return, or at least was given no credit for his competence. He withdrew to the island of Capri in 26 CE and governed the empire from there, which Romans found deeply suspicious. His reign was marked by treason trials in which senators denounced each other for insulting the emperor's dignity, a practice Tiberius at first discouraged and then seemed to allow or even encourage. An ambitious prefect of the Praetorian Guard named Sejanus built enormous power by exploiting Tiberius's absence from Rome, until Tiberius had him arrested and executed. He died at 78, unloved and suspicious to the end. His successor Gaius, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, has become history's shorthand for imperial madness. He ruled only 4 years, from 37 to 41 CE, and the ancient sources attribute to him such extravagances as declaring himself a living god, making his horse a consul, and various sexual atrocities. Historians debate how much of this is true and how much is the invention of sources who had their own reasons to blacken his memory. What seems clear is that Caligula was erratic, possibly ill after a fever in his first year, and spent money recklessly before being assassinated by Praetorian officers and senators who had had enough. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace and was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard, which gives you a sense of how the process had evolved. He ruled from 41 to 54 CE and was far more capable than his family seems to have expected or his portrait in comedy suggests. He was a scholar who had written histories of the Etruscans and Carthaginians before becoming emperor. His reign saw the conquest of Britain, begun in 43 CE, and a series of administrative reforms that strengthened the central government. He extended Roman citizenship more broadly, which the aristocracy resented. He died, possibly poisoned by his fourth wife Agrippina, who was also his niece, which tells you something about the gene pool of the Julio-Claudians. Agrippina had a son from a previous marriage whom she wanted to be emperor. His name was Nero, and he ruled from 54 to 68 CE. His reign began promisingly, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. He was young, interested in art and music and chariot racing, and for the first years, the government worked well enough. Then things unraveled. He had his mother killed in 59 CE. He had his first wife Octavia killed. He kicked his second wife Poppaea to death while she was pregnant, or so the sources say, and he may or may not have had something to do with the great fire that burned much of Rome in 64 CE. He persecuted Christians in Rome after the fire, making them the scapegoats, and killed, among others, the apostles Peter and Paul, though these identifications are disputed. Nero rebuilt much of Rome after the fire in a more regularized plan, and built for himself an enormous palace complex called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, whose entrance hall reportedly contained a rotating dining room and a statue of Nero as the sun god, 120 feet tall. In 68 CE, provincial governors rebelled. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. He fled and killed himself in a suburban villa, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30. With him, the Julio-Claudian line ended. The year of the 4 emperors and the Flavians. The year 69 CE demonstrated something that Augustus had tried to obscure, that the emperor's power rested ultimately on the army, and whoever commanded the most loyal army could be emperor. 4 men held the title that year: Galba, who was quickly murdered by the Praetorian Guard; Otho, a former governor who committed suicide after a single military defeat; Vitellius, a general from the Rhine armies who was captured and killed by the forces of the fourth contender; and finally Vespasian, who had been commanding Roman forces in Judea, suppressing a major Jewish revolt. Vespasian was the first emperor who had no connection whatsoever to Julius Caesar's family. He was from a respectable but not aristocratic Italian family, a career soldier who had served in Britain and elsewhere. He was blunt, practical, and famous for his sense of humor. When told he was dying, he reportedly said, "Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god," a reference to the custom of deifying deceased emperors. He was the founder of the Flavian dynasty. His reign restored order and fiscal discipline after the chaos of 69. He completed the Colosseum, began to replace Nero's Golden House with something that served the public rather than one man's vanity. He suppressed the Jewish revolt, with his son Titus sacking Jerusalem and destroying the temple in 70 CE, an event of catastrophic importance for Jewish history and diaspora. Titus succeeded his father in 79 CE and proved genuinely popular. He completed the Colosseum and inaugurated it with 100 days of games. He oversaw the response to one of the great natural disasters of ancient history, the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and pumice. The letters of Pliny the Younger, who watched the eruption from across the bay and whose uncle died trying to rescue survivors, are among the most precise eyewitness accounts of a natural disaster from the ancient world. Titus died after only 2 years, to widespread grief. His brother Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 CE, was far less beloved. He was effective at administration and at military matters, but increasingly paranoid about conspiracy, conducting treason trials that revived the worst memories of Tiberius. He was assassinated in a court conspiracy in 96 CE. The Senate condemned his memory, defacing his portraits and erasing his name from public inscriptions, a practice called damnatio memoriae. The 5 good emperors and the height of empire. The period from 96 to 180 CE is often called the era of the 5 good emperors, a somewhat oversimplified label, but one that captures something real. These 5 men, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, presided over what the historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, called the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Gibbon was prone to sweeping statements, and the misery of slaves and the poor and conquered peoples slightly complicates the picture. But the 2nd century CE was genuinely a period of unusual stability and prosperity for the Roman world. Nerva was elderly and ruled only 2 years, but he established the practice that would define this period, adopting a capable man as his successor rather than relying on biological inheritance. Each of these emperors, except Marcus Aurelius, died without a surviving son and chose a successor based on merit or something approaching it. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, was the first emperor born in a province in Spain, and he remains the only emperor to have his ashes interred in Rome under his own column, the magnificent Trajan's Column, which still stands in Rome today and depicts in spiraling relief sculpture his campaigns against the Dacians. He conquered Dacia, roughly modern Romania, adding its gold and silver mines to the empire's wealth. He also conquered Mesopotamia briefly, reaching the Persian Gulf and reportedly lamenting that he was too old to follow Alexander's path to India. He died on the way home from that eastern campaign. Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138, was something different, a builder and an intellectual rather than a conqueror. He pulled back from Trajan's eastern conquests, judging them unsustainable, which was practical but cost him popularity with those who preferred the idea of endless expansion. He traveled the empire constantly, visiting nearly every province, and left monuments everywhere he went. In Britain, he built the wall that still bears his name, stretching across the island's narrow waist to mark the northern limit of Roman civilization. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome in the form that still stands today, the concrete dome of which is one of the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world. He was also deeply in love with a young Greek man named Antinous, who drowned in the Nile in 130 CE under circumstances that were never explained. Hadrian's grief was extraordinary. He deified Antinous and established a cult in his honor that spread across the empire, with hundreds of temples and thousands of surviving portrait statues, making Antinous one of the most frequently depicted individuals from the ancient world. Antoninus Pius ruled from 138 to 161, an exceptionally long and exceptionally uneventful reign. He managed the empire with competence and kept the peace, which is actually very difficult to do and is rarely given the credit it deserves. He pushed the wall in Britain slightly northward to a new line, the Antonine Wall, though it was later abandoned, and Hadrian's Wall became the permanent frontier. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180, is the philosopher emperor, an image he earned entirely through his own writings. He had been trained as a Stoic philosopher and continued to practice Stoicism throughout his reign, writing his private philosophical notebook in Greek, a collection we know as the Meditations. The Meditations are not a systematic philosophical treatise, but a personal discipline of thought, a man in the most powerful position in the world reminding himself, over and over, that wealth and power are nothing, that death comes for all, that the only good lies in virtue and reason, and doing what is right regardless of outcome. They are remarkable documents, and they have moved readers across 2,000 years precisely because they are so unmistakably sincere. Marcus spent much of his reign at war on the Danube frontier, defending against Germanic pressure that would intensify in the centuries after his death. He was a reluctant warrior who preferred philosophy and found war exactly as grim as it is. He persecuted Christians, not out of particular animus, but as a matter of public order, and this mars his reputation in some eyes without quite destroying his fundamental humanity in others. He broke the adopted succession by allowing his biological son, Commodus, to succeed him. It was a catastrophic choice. The crisis of the 3rd century. Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192, was the first emperor since Domitian to seem genuinely, dangerously unhinged. He became obsessed with the gladiatorial games, fighting in the arena himself, which Romans found degrading rather than impressive, and identified himself with Hercules and eventually with the god himself. He renamed Rome the Colonia Commodiana and renamed the months of the year after his various titles. He was strangled in his bath by a wrestler hired by his advisors and court officials who had had quite enough. After Commodus, another year of the 5 emperors in 193, another round of armies proclaiming their generals, another series of civil wars. The winner was Septimius Severus, an African from Leptis Magna in modern Libya, the first emperor from Africa. He ruled until 211, was a competent soldier and a harsh administrator, and died at York in Britain during a northern campaign. His last advice to his sons was reportedly, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and care nothing for the rest." His sons were not harmonious. Caracalla murdered his brother Geta and ruled alone until he was assassinated in 217. He did one genuinely significant thing. In 212, he issued an edict extending Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. This was partly for tax reasons, since citizens paid certain taxes that non-citizens did not. But its long-term effect was to blur the distinction between Romans and those they had ruled, making the empire more uniform and in some ways more robust. After Caracalla, the 3rd century became a blur of emperors who rose and fell with terrible speed. Between 235 and 284, the empire had more than 50 emperors in 50 years. Most were killed by their own soldiers. Some ruled for only weeks or months. The empire simultaneously suffered invasion on multiple fronts. Germanic tribes pressing along the Rhine and Danube, a new and aggressive Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, on the eastern frontier, and occasional breakaway regions like the Palmyrene Empire in the east and the Gallic Empire in the west. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was genuinely catastrophic. Trade networks broke down, cities shrank, agriculture suffered, plague killed enormous numbers. The silver in Roman coins was so diluted that inflation made prices meaningless. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Mediterranean world of 275 CE looked fundamentally different, poorer and more fragmented and more militarized than the Mediterranean world of 175 CE. And yet the empire survived. It survived because of the resilience of its administrative structures, the continuing loyalty of the armies to the Roman idea, even when they could not agree on who should lead it, and because several capable soldier emperors in the 3rd century's final decades managed to drive back the invaders and begin a process of restoration. Aurelian, emperor from 270 to 275, reunified the breakaway regions, repelled invaders on multiple fronts, and built the massive walls around Rome that still partly stand today, the Aurelian Walls, which were needed because the capital of the empire was no longer safe. He was assassinated by his own officers, as so many were, but he had saved something. Diocletian and the reorganized empire. Diocletian, who became emperor in 284, was one of the most significant rulers Rome ever had, though he is less famous than Caesar or Augustus, partly because what he did was organizational rather than dramatic. He ruled until 305, a reign of more than 20 years, which was extraordinary given what the previous 50 years had looked like. And then he retired voluntarily to his enormous palace in Split, on the coast of what is now Croatia, becoming the only Roman emperor to voluntarily give up power and then resist attempts to draw him back. When political associates urged him to return to power, he reportedly said he wished they could see the cabbages he was growing, and they would understand why he preferred Split to Rome. Diocletian understood that one man could not govern an empire this large under the pressures it now faced. He instituted the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, with each controlling a different part of the empire. This was meant to solve succession by creating it in advance, to provide command on multiple fronts simultaneously, and to reduce the incentive for provincial generals to rebel, since there were already multiple emperors to aspire to be. He also massively expanded the bureaucracy and the army, doubled the number of provinces, restructured taxation, and issued an edict on maximum prices to combat inflation, which mostly did not work because price controls that are not enforced do not work, but it showed that someone was thinking about the problem. He persecuted Christians in the Great Persecution of 303, the last and largest coordinated attempt to suppress Christianity in the Roman Empire. He failed because Christianity had by then grown too large and too embedded in the social fabric to uproot by decree and violence. After Diocletian's retirement, the Tetrarchy immediately broke down into civil war, because the logic of dividing power only works if all the powerful men involved accept the division. Constantine, the son of one of the junior emperors, fought his way to sole control over the empire in a series of wars between 306 and 324. Constantine is one of the most consequential figures in world history, which is a large claim that happens to be true. At the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, he defeated his rival Maxentius, and subsequent tradition held that before the battle he had received a Christian vision, the Chi-Rho symbol, with the message in this sign, conquer. Whether this happened exactly as described, whether it was the experience that turned Constantine toward Christianity or simply a political calculation, is a question historians still debate. What is not debatable is that in 313, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and specifically protected Christians. Constantine went further. He favored Christianity actively, funding the building of churches, adjudicating theological disputes, convening the Council of Nicaea in 325 to settle a major theological controversy about the nature of Christ. He did not make Christianity the official state religion that would come later, but he made it the favored religion of the emperor, which had the same practical effect over time. He also moved the capital of the empire to a new city, Constantinople, built on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosphorus, the strait between Europe and Asia. It was a brilliant strategic location and a dramatic statement that Rome, the city, was no longer automatically the center of the Roman world. The divided empire and the coming storm. After Constantine, the empire continued to struggle with the question of succession and the related question of unity. His sons fought each other. Later emperors struggled with the armies and with the barbarian peoples who increasingly served in those armies. Christianity became the official religion under Theodosius in 380, and suddenly the great civic cults of Rome, the sacrifices and the temples and the festivals, became illegal. This was an enormous cultural rupture, accomplished faster than perhaps even the Christians who desired it had expected. Theodosius also made a decision that seemed practical and turned out to be historically enormous. In 395, he divided the empire between his two sons. Arcadius took the east, Honorius took the west. They were children, controlled by advisors, and the division was meant to be administrative rather than permanent. It became permanent. The western half of the empire was under far more pressure than the east. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were long, the armies were expensive, the economy had never fully recovered from the 3rd century crisis, and increasingly the people defending Roman territory were not Romans in any cultural sense, but Germanic peoples who had been settled within the empire as federates, fighting for pay under their own commanders. These arrangements worked for a time, but they also meant that loyalty to Rome was increasingly instrumental rather than cultural. The Huns, a nomadic people from the eastern steppes whose origins are still debated by historians, arrived in Europe in the late 4th century and set off a chain reaction. Germanic peoples who had been living relatively peacefully on the periphery of the empire were now being pushed by the Huns and sought refuge inside Roman territory. The Visigoths crossed the Danube in 376 with permission from the Roman government, were mistreated by local officials, and rose in revolt. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, they killed the Emperor Valens and destroyed his army, demonstrating that Roman armies could be defeated by peoples Rome had regarded as subordinate. In 410, something happened that shook the Roman world to its foundations. A Visigoth force under Alaric sacked Rome. The Eternal City, which had not been taken by an enemy since the Gauls 800 years before, was looted for 3 days. People across the empire were stunned. Saint Augustine, hearing the news in North Africa, began writing the City of God, which argued that the true city, the city that mattered, was not Rome but the heavenly Jerusalem, and that the sack of Rome should not shake Christian faith because Christian faith was not in Rome but in God. It was one of the most influential works of Christian theology ever written, and it exists because Rome fell. The fall of the Western Empire. The Western Roman Empire did not fall in a moment. It dissolved over decades in a process so gradual that many people living through it may not have been certain when, exactly, Rome had stopped existing. The institutions persisted, the titles continued, the laws were still cited, the roads were still traveled. What changed was who controlled the armies, and who controlled the armies controlled everything. The century after the sack of Rome in 410 saw the Western Empire progressively lose territory to Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths established themselves in southwestern France and Spain. The Vandals, crossing from Spain into North Africa, seized the richest provinces of the West, including the grain supply, and in 455 sacked Rome again. The Burgundians settled in the Rhone Valley. The Franks consolidated control over much of Gaul. Britain, unable to be reinforced, was left to its own devices around 410 when the Emperor Honorius reportedly told the cities there to defend themselves, a signal, if that is what it was, that had enormous consequences for what Britain would become. By the mid-5th century, the Western emperors were largely puppets controlled by barbarian military commanders. A Hunnic king named Attila, who had united the Hunnic peoples and extracted enormous tribute from the Eastern Empire, invaded the West in 451 and was turned back at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, one of the largest battles of the ancient world, by a Roman-Visigoth alliance under the general Aetius. Attila invaded Italy in 452 but pulled back, perhaps due to disease, perhaps because Pope Leo I met him and talked him out of sacking Rome, a story that became legendary regardless of its accuracy. Attila died in 453 and his empire fragmented. Aetius, who had saved the West and was called by some the last of the Romans, was murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III in 454, who was himself murdered the following year. After that, emperors in the West came and went with dizzying speed, installed and removed by the real power behind the throne, whoever commanded the German Federates. In 476, a man named Romulus Augustulus, a teenage boy who had been placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, who decided not to bother installing another emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople and ruled Italy as a king in his own name. Romulus Augustulus, with his name combining both the city's founder and its greatest emperor, was sent into comfortable retirement in southern Italy. The date 476 has become the conventional marker for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and it is useful as a marker even if the people living through it did not experience it as a moment of terminal collapse. Odoacer ruled for years. The Eastern Empire continued. Roman law continued to be used. Latin continued to be spoken. The Catholic Church continued to grow in power and influence, preserving elements of Roman culture even as the political structures changed. The fall of Rome was not the end of the ancient world. It was the beginning of a very long and complicated transformation into the medieval world. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium. It would be a profound mistake to talk about the fall of Rome without acknowledging that half of the Roman Empire did not fall in 476. The eastern half, which modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants called themselves Romans and never forgot that they were, continued for nearly 1,000 years after the Western Empire collapsed. Constantinople was the most fortified city in the medieval world, protected by massive triple walls on the land side and controlling the sea lanes through the Bosphorus. The eastern provinces were more urbanized, more commercially sophisticated, and wealthier than the West. Greek was the language of the East, and as Latin slowly faded from daily use in the eastern provinces, Greek took over even official functions, though the Byzantines retained Latin as a legal language for centuries. The Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, came closer than any later figure to restoring the old Roman Empire. He reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and much of Italy from the Ostrogoths, though Italy was devastated in the process. He issued the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, a comprehensive codification of Roman law that became the foundation of most European legal systems and much of the international law that governs the world today. He built the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, a church of such architectural audacity that when the dome was complete, Justinian reportedly said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." The Hagia Sophia stands today and is still visually overwhelming after 15 centuries. The Byzantine Empire had its own cycles of strength and weakness. The Arab-Muslim conquests of the 7th century stripped away Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa permanently, reducing the empire to Anatolia, Greece, and remnants in Italy and the Balkans. The empire survived by adapting, by becoming more explicitly Greek rather than Roman universal, by developing a sophisticated diplomacy and a theological culture of extraordinary intensity. It endured through the medieval period as a bulwark against Arab expansion into Europe, through the Crusades, which were frequently problematic from the Byzantine perspective, since the Crusaders often seemed more interested in Byzantine wealth than in liberating Jerusalem, and through waves of Turkish expansion in Anatolia that gradually reduced Byzantine territory to little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings. The end came on May 29, 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan maimed II, who had surrounded Constantinople with an enormous army and a navy and the largest cannon the world had yet seen, broke through the walls that had resisted so many previous sieges. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, reportedly removed his imperial regalia, said that the city was falling but he would not, and led a final charge into the Ottoman forces. His body was never identified. He was 57 years old. With him, the last emperor who could trace his lineage and his title in an unbroken line to Augustus died in the breach of a city wall. Rome, which had begun on the hills above the Tiber sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era, ended, in some sense, in the streets of Constantinople in the 15th century of the Common Era. Between those two moments lay more than 2,000 years of continuous history, the longest and most influential story any single political tradition has yet told. What Rome built and what it left behind. When we talk about what Rome left behind, we are really talking about ourselves. The distance between Rome and the modern world is not as great as it might appear. The languages of France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Romania, and much of Switzerland, the Romance languages, are directly descended from Latin, which was spread by Roman conquest and administration and never replaced because it was too deeply embedded to remove. English, which is Germanic at its root, absorbed enormous quantities of Latin vocabulary through French after the Norman conquest, and through the Renaissance revival of classical learning, and through the Catholic Church's maintenance of Latin as its liturgical language for nearly 2 millennia. When English speakers use words like justice, liberty, republic, senate, military, civil, urban, rural, legal, rational, and several thousand others, they are using Latin. Roman law, codified most systematically by Justinian, but developed over centuries of jurisprudence, is the foundation of legal systems across most of Europe, Latin America, and many other parts of the world. The concepts of legal personhood, property rights, contract, inheritance, the presumption of innocence, the adversarial trial, these are Roman inheritances. The Roman Catholic Church, which took its name from the Catholic, meaning universal, and its organizational structure from the Roman administrative model of provinces and dioceses, spread Christianity across the former Roman world and beyond. The Pope in Rome continued what had been, in a very different sense, a Roman tradition of universal authority. The Church's use of Latin kept that language alive as an international medium of learned communication for 1,000 years after the empire fell. Architecture and engineering were transformed by Roman techniques. The arch, the vault, the dome. Romans did not invent all of these, but they developed and deployed them on a scale and with a confidence that had never been seen before. Concrete, which Romans used extensively to construct things that still stand, was lost after the empire fell and only rediscovered in the modern era. Roman roads, many of them still traceable in the landscape if not still in use, connected a world in ways that persisted for centuries after the empire that built them was gone. The very political vocabulary of the modern West is Roman. Republic, from res publica, the public thing. Senate, from senatus, the council of elders. Constitution, constitution. Emperor, from imperator, province, province. Forum, forum. Census, census. Democracy, though Greek in origin, filtered to the modern world largely through Roman practice. The founding fathers of the United States were deeply read in Roman history and Roman political theory. The Senate chamber is the Senate chamber because it is the Senate. The eagle on the American seal is descended from the Roman eagle standard. Fasces, bundles of rods that were the symbol of Roman magisterial authority, appear in the decor of the Lincoln Memorial and in various official American symbols, though the word fascism, which also derives from fasces, gave the symbol rather uncomfortable associations in the 20th century. Rome's failures and crimes also left marks. The scale of Roman slavery was enormous, and the Roman economy was built on enslaved labor in ways that shaped how subsequent European civilizations thought about race and labor. Roman imperial ideology, the idea that one power had the right and the destiny to rule the world for the world's own benefit, was used for centuries by European powers to justify their own empires, not always consciously, but the template was there and it was used. The persecution of Christians, the destruction of Jerusalem, the enslavement of conquered peoples, the gladiatorial games, the systematic exploitation of provincial economies for the benefit of Rome. These too are Roman legacies, not in the sense that they were unique to Rome, because most ancient societies practiced similar things, but in the sense that they were preserved in record and in cultural memory and shaped how succeeding civilizations thought about power and its uses. A long night and a quiet road. And so we come, after more than 1,000 years of wandering, to the end of our road. If you have made it this far, you have been in the company of a remarkable human story. You have been with the she-wolf and the shepherd boy, with the senators who refused a king and the senators who killed the man who might have become one. You have been at Cana, where tens of thousands died in an afternoon, and at the Milvian Bridge, where a dream changed the religion of the Western world. You have stood in the shadow of the Colosseum, which was begun by a man trying to give Rome back to itself after a tyrant had enclosed it in gold. You have sat, perhaps, on a cold night on Hadrian's wall, listening for sound beyond the firelight. You have watched the last emperor walk into the breach, removing his purple before the end. What does all of it mean? That is perhaps a question for a lighter, more alert hour. Tonight, what I hope you take with you into sleep is simply the sense of how much human story can happen in a single stretch of ground, along a single river, in the hills above a particular bend, in a particular waterway in central Italy. Rome was not destiny. It was not inevitable. It was people, generation after generation, making choices in conditions they did not fully understand, building institutions that outlasted them and breaking institutions that had seemed unbreakable, loving and fearing and hoping, and making catastrophic errors and sometimes, somehow, doing something beautiful. The Roman road, the great stone-paved roads that ran straight across hills and marshes because Rome valued directness and permanence, those roads are still there in places. In Britain, you can walk along the line of an old Roman road and know that a soldier walked here, a merchant, a letter carrier, someone who was tired and cold and far from home and thinking about getting back. 2,000 years ago, and the road is still there. There is something in that which I find genuinely comforting, in the quiet way that very old things are comforting. Not that Rome was good or that things were better then, but simply that things were, that people lived and built and argued and loved and died. And some of what they built is still here, and that continuity of human effort across the centuries is, in its way, remarkable. Rome began on 7 hills by a river. It became the idea that one civilization could hold the whole world in common. It fractured, it transformed, it became something else. And what it became something else in turn. And here we are, in the long chain of what came after, still speaking its words and living in its shadow, sometimes knowing it and often not. That seems like a good place to rest. You have been on a long journey tonight. The ancient world is behind you now, patient and still in the way that very old things are still. The emperors and the consuls and the tribunes and the senators have gone back to their histories. The legions have returned to their camps. The roads are quiet. Thank you for wandering through the centuries with me. Sleep well.